we are very fortunate to have with us Professor Maya Stiller. She just talked to us about how within a day she jumped from Zhong to Zhong, traveling internationally via Zoom meetings. But today, right now, she's joining us domestically. And Maya, currently, she is Associate Professor of Korean Art History and Visual Culture at the University of Kansas. She grew up in Germany, and she double majored in Korean Studies and Art Histories for both BA and MA from Humboldt University. She also received a doctorate in East Asian art history from Free University in Berlin. And later, I have not met many scholars like her. She received a second PhD in Asian languages and cultures from UCLA, and I believe is focusing on Buddhism. She just published a new book, and the title is Carving Statues at Kŭmgangsan, or the famous Diamond Mountains, Elite Graffiti in Premodern Korea. So this new publication is actually the subject, part of which is going to be her talk today, Elite Graffiti, Kinship, and Social Capital, Cultural Pilgrimages to Kŭmgangsan in Pre-1900 Korea. So please welcome Professor Stiller.
Thank you, everyone, for coming to my talk today, and thanks so much to Professor Wang for the generous introduction. And I would also like to thank the East Asia Center for sponsoring this talk, and I'm looking forward to reconnecting with colleagues and meeting some new ones during the Q&A. So in this talk, I will present some core examples from my book, Carving Status at Kmgangsan, and which has just been published by University of Washington Press. In this book, I explain the late Joseon period socio-cultural history of Kmgangsan, also known as the Diamond Mountains or Mount Kŭmgang, which, as you all know, is located in present-day North Korea. The focus of this talk is Kmgangsan, located today just a few miles north of the DMZ. And this map shows the Joseon period provincial borders of Gangwon province, where Kmgangsan is located, and Gangwon itself is located in the central part of the Korean peninsula. So in order to reach Kmgangsan, people traveled from Seoul, then Hansong or Hanyang, via the northeastern highway that connects to several access routes to Kmgangsan. And the total distance between the capital and Kmgangsan is about 380 li, which equals around 95 miles or 150 kilometers. It is mountainous terrain, so don't think that 95 miles, oh, that that can be easily done in a day or so. But because they are, Korea is very mountainous, and particularly Gangwon has many mountains. It took a couple of days to get there. So I calculated around a week, so at least 4 to 5 days if one was traveling by horse from Seoul to the mountain. And this is a photograph of one of several majestic panoramic vistas of nature for which Kmgangsan is so famous. This photograph depicts the eroded granite cliffs of Manmulcho in the outer part of the mountain. And the rock has a high concentration of quartz and feldspar, and that's why the rocks appear in a slightly gray color. If you go to Hierarchical in South Korea, you will encounter a similar type of rock. Kmgangsan is also known for its emerald green pools, of which you can see a few here. On the upper left is Palsangdam, or the upper 8 pools. On the upper right is Yeonju Pool, or Yeonju Dam, in Ongnyu-dong, in the outer part of the mountain. And on 2 separate occasions, in 2008 and 2014, I conducted field research at Kmgangsan. And in this picture, I'm sitting on a rock at the top of a cliff from where I was looking down at Palsang Dam, which you saw earlier. During my visit, my attention was drawn to the thousands of inscriptions that had been carved everywhere on rocks and boulders on the path, particularly at renowned locations such as 10,000 Folds Ravine or Mampokdong and Jade Stream Ravine or Ongnyu-dong. And, originally I had planned to do field research on the Buddhist heritage of the mountain, and I took many pictures of the Maebul or the carved Buddhist statues. But my attention was really drawn to the quantity and the variety of signatures on the rocks, which I had never encountered being mentioned in any secondary sources on the mountain. And so I immediately began to appreciate the connection between these inscriptions and the reasons why so many people traveled to Kŭmgangsan throughout the late Joseon. And so I spent most of my time at the mountains just photographing rock inscriptions, and I took thousands of photographs. Since South Korean scholars are currently unable to travel to Kŭmgangsan owing to its location in North Korea, I believe I'm one of the very few contemporary scholars who have been able to personally collect rock inscription data from this mountain. Carving status would have been impossible to write had I not seen the mountains in person, photographed the rock carvings, and been granted 3 postdoctoral years at Harvard's Korea Institute to build and research a database of rock inscriptions, of which you can see a detail in the slide. And this is just one of many Excel files that I created over the years. I would have never realized that Kŭmgangsan, so without doing all this research and field research, I would have never realized that Kŭmgangsan has the largest collection of autographic inscriptions in East Asia and perhaps the world. And this discovery alone represents an important new finding in the field of Korean art and culture history. So far, let me know if there's something wrong with the screen or you can't see anything, because sometimes there is maybe like a little delay in the slides. So far, Kŭmgangsan has been primarily discussed in the context of literati style landscape painting. For example, Jong-sun's complete view of inner Kŭmgang, which you can see here in the slide. Many of you may have heard about the conventional framework of Kmgangsan sohwa or true view landscape painting, a specific type of painting that merged several earlier traditions into one in the early 18th century and purportedly functioned as virtual travel guides. An iconized figure in this discussion is Jong-sun, and it is commonly assumed that his landscape paintings had a huge impact on later landscape traditions that supposedly popularized Kŭmgangsan travel. Recent scholarship by Song-Lim Kim, J.P. Park, and others has pointed to the increasing demand for and the value of Jong-sun's artworks among broader parts of the elite community, showing that depictions of real places were used to announce and position one's social status to the community. According to the latest narrative, late Joseon Dynasty scholars used famous sites, such as Kŭmgangsan, for identity construction and for self-promotion. Although I agree with the latest research on the important social functions of landscape painting, my work invokes a paradigm shift in art historical research, pivoting around the prestigious genre of landscape painting. A broader view of Joseon visual and material culture is necessary in order to understand Kŭmgangsan travel. My research also seeks to expand the field of pilgrimage studies. East Asian pilgrimage studies have assumed that religious elements are at the core of every pilgrimage, in which a devotee goes on a long distance voyage to a sacred site for reasons of personal piety, conceiving the journey in terms of repentance, expiation, and salvation. Challenging the dominance of such religious and political narratives in pilgrimage studies, this book points out the social significance of the traveler's site-specific cultural performances, establishing the importance of Kŭmgangsan as a quintessential example of a socio-cultural pilgrimage site in pre-modern East Asia, in addition to being a site that attracted Buddhist pilgrims. I devised the term commemoration pilgrimage to refer to a type of travel in which the major motivation was the construction and the appreciation of memory. Late Joseon established aristocratic families residing in the capital, as well as aspiring elites and local elites residing in the provinces, made their achievements known among their peers by visualizing their cultural cachet at Kmgangsan, revealing spatial dimensions of fierce intra-elite competition. And what you can see here on the right-hand side is a detail of a photograph of an agnatic clusters of a family of E, like an E clan that traveled to Kŭmgangsan together and visualized their travel through this kind of autographic agnatic cluster. Cultural pilgrimages to Kmgangsan were not necessarily devoid of spiritual or religious components. Many travelers commemorating their ancestors and teachers became very emotional when seeing their traces at Kmgangsan. Some even reported experiencing a spiritual connection while touching their ancestors' writing. Such emotional affirmation of ancestral ties might have been one of the main reasons for literatus to travel to Kmgangsan, as it was part of the memorial site construction process that strengthened the traveler's social belonging and elite identity. Social memory motivations were as strong as the religious motivations discussed in the previous scholarship. My book expands existing scholarship by introducing an entirely new field, autographic rock inscriptions as visible forms of social memory. In contrast to the well-examined history of rock inscriptions in China, which has been researched by scholars such as Robert Harris and Lothar Lederose, Korean rock inscriptions are largely unexplored. In late imperial China, high-ranking officials had lengthy inscriptions, including the names of travelers and their titles, as well as the date and reason for their travel, carved at mountains they visited. So we have evidence for that from mountains such as Qishan and Wuishan. Such inscriptions were more institutionally accepted ways of cultural remembering. However, Korean travelers used more a personal mode of expression of cultural remembering, which drew attention to the self, just the name. By adding signatures to Kmgangsan's rock surface, travelers could initiate their remembering outside of institutional boundaries and broaden the range of people who would see their names. With no dates or office titles, the emphasis of the autograph is highly personal. Such minimalist development of autographic graffiti makes Joseon travel activities exceptional. Using a combination of disciplinary approaches from art history, literature, and social history, I analyze autographic inscriptions to argue that Kmgangsan's Buddhist monasteries, pavilions, and waterfalls became sites of social memory. First, the carving of graffiti was an exclusive elite practice, but towards the late Joseon, Korean mountains such as Kmgangsan developed into a heterotopic space where near and non-elites wrote their names in an act of self-commemoration because their names would otherwise not be transmitted to posterity. Elite names were usually commemorated through elite channels of communication such as literary connections, tomb skill inscriptions, etc., etc. And those were channels that the average non-elite or near-elite would not have been had access to. So my work shows that unlike other sacred mountains in East Asia, Kmgangsan was not just a destination for religious pilgrims and tourists, but it was also an important site of social engineering. Discussion points of this talk include my methodology, terms that I will look at, and I will show examples showing the historical development of the graffiti and the types of methods that travelers used to impose their presence at the mountain, for example, by modifying the size, placement, and the type of calligraphy. Joseon period scholars refer to autographic inscriptions, which were a ubiquitous visual element of the late Joseon landscape, as Kmgangsan. This term frequently appears in mid to late Joseon literary genres such as travel records, songs, gazetteers, and encyclopedias. Joseon scholars define Kmgangsan as signing one's name with other people after visiting or seeing a site. I also use the term graffiti because I understand that graffiti deployed in modern English refers to street art or art created on urban surfaces that is anonymous and is produced against local laws. So the common use of graffiti has like negative social connotations, but when using this term, I follow conventions in the field of archaeology, where this term is only superficially related to the modern definition of graffiti. It's not negative, it's not against the laws, but scholars of modern street graffiti might argue that our understanding of graffiti was actually quite flawed. So if used in an archaeological sense, in a pre-modern cultural context, graffiti is not something negative, but is rather adding social and cultural value to a location. During the Joseon period, there were some critical voices about Kmgangsan. Yu Chung, Yoon-hyu, Lee Dong-hang, for example, considered Kmgangsan an inappropriate practice desecrating the landscape. But the common ground of all these late Joseon critical voices is that the really powerful people and the real junzi, they do not carve their names, only the vulgar scholars do it. But if you look at the travel inscriptions, the travel records, like travel diaries, etc., that data shows that this was a double standard because even the highest ranking government officials carved their names. And so in my work, I use terms such as autographs, signatures, and graffiti to refer to these inscriptions. In terms of methodology, I first examined approximately 8,000 photographs that I took during field research at Kmgangsan. So that I spent basically the first couple of months of my 3-year tenure at Harvard doing just that. But it took me more than a year to just select photographs and decipher the characters of the inscriptions, figuring out like not all the inscriptions are legible, as you can see here, due to erosion and biological overgrowth. I had to learn a lot of digital photo processing in order to make those inscriptions legible. And so all the pictures you see in this presentation are actually all edited with Adobe Photoshop. So after logging all the inscriptions, I then conducted a prosopographical analysis. And the time required to research the travelers' names and trace their vitae among thousands of royal palace records, such as the Joseon Wangzhe or the Seungjeonwon Ilki, government examination rosters, such as the Munghwa, the highest government exam, civil government exam, stele inscriptions. I looked a lot at the Jokbo charts or genealogical charts. So doing all that for just one name or a cluster of names took a lot of time. And if I was able to find a person's name in one of these records and one of these historical documents, I considered the name as identifiable. And Kŭmgangsan inscriptions can be divided into several different types. Altogether, I found 4,687 inscriptions. Out of this number, around 4,500 are names of people that traveled to Kŭmgangsan between the early 16th to early 20th century. So we're talking about 400 years, minimum 400 years of in terms of time frame. And some inscribers praise the landscape of road place names, but in contrast to pilgrimage sites such as Taishan in China, such inscriptions are quite rare. And there's virtually zero inscriptions about Buddhism. So again, very different from some cases in China. We have a couple of modern ones, like from the early 20th century, but not pre-modern. Of all those inscribed names that I transcribed, recorded, logged, did a prosopographical analysis, Around 2,400 are arranged in clusters, and those became the core of my research, because with the single names, it was really hard to pin down which of the names that appeared in the records were could be identified with a particular person, because the same name can appear and again in different files. And so I focused on these clusters, which I again divided into agnatic, associative, and agnatic associative, which you can see here on the right side. This is an Excel file that contains the 848 clusters. And so, with digital humanities scholarship, what you do is basically you transform textual data and visual data into numerical data so to make it legible for the computer. And so this is what you see here in this Excel file. I basically, all the numbers you see are referencing text and images, but you see numbers because that's what the computer can read, right? So, I will talk about this later, how this relates to one of my DH projects. And all these different clusters, what was really fascinating to find out about was that they all have links to either high elite, landed elite or local elite, near elite social backgrounds. And so the potential to identify these individuals behind the names of clusters was what really kept me going on with the project. And one cluster typically consisted of 2 to 7 members of a family or a group of individuals that travel to the mountain together. Sometimes the cluster is cross-generational, so there would be one generation that traveled to the mountain, carved their names, and then like 2-3 generations later, you have their descendants go to the mountain and carve their names next to those of their ancestors. So that's why we had these large, like agnatic clusters. And these were, of course, really renowned families from the capital who were able to do that. And so for the remainder of this talk, I will discuss these clusters that are evidence for the strong social competition between high elites, lower elites, near elites, and non-elites in the late Joseon period. But before I get into the clusters, I would like to emphasize that my work has 2 digital humanities aspects. For, I would say, the past 10 years since my graduate years at UCLA, I've been working with historical GIS, which means that I have been creating historical maps from scratch. And in those maps, I visualize my research results. And oftentimes by working on the maps, I realize things that I hadn't realized while I was looking at the text or the images themselves. So what I'll show you here are 2 maps that I created for this project. This one demonstrates the spatial distribution of the graffiti. And I created this map in order to better understand which locations at Kmgangsan had particularly large numbers of inscriptions. So it turned out that Mampokdong, or 10,000 Folds Ravine, in the inner part of the mountain had the largest numbers, with more than 1,700 inscriptions, followed by Bodogam, which is just behind Mampokdong. And then in the outer part of the mountain, we have Ongnudong and Kuryongyong with several hundred names each. And the distribution of these inscriptions can be explained by the path that travelers followed through the mountain. So this map shows the itineraries of 2 late Joseon travelers, Ihajin and Kim Jang-jup, and they represent like this kind of typical path and how the path itself also developed in the late Joseon, how it expanded outward to the outer part of the mountain. So travelers typically began their journey at Tanbalyong, which is located west of Kŭmgangsan, and which is typically considered the entryway into the gateway into the mountain. And then Kmgangsan, as I mentioned earlier, is divided into inner and outer Kmgang. So it has like these 2 parts that are divided by a natural ridge. Travelers would first visit the inner part of the mountain, so Changhansa, Pyeonsa, Mampokdong, Bodogam, and then Myogisang was kind of the last waypoint before getting into the outer part of the mountain. Nesujom was the that's where the hard divide is between inner and outer Kmgang. And then they would move on to the outer part and then move on to see pavilions and monasteries along the coast. So the map portion is one aspect of my DH work. And then the other part of my DH work is this creation of a digital platform with a trilingual search engine, which required the creation of feature-level metadata and relational data about Kŭmgangsan rock inscriptions, of which you've seen some parts earlier, because all those Excel files I showed you, those are part of curating the metadata behind those inscriptions. And then, of course, creating a website from scratch. This is not WordPress or anything. This is really programmed. It has been programmed from scratch. And I designed and implemented a MySQL-powered server that my website feeds from. And so whenever people will look at the filtered search engine part of this project, all the data will be coming from the MySQL server. And so this website, which is not public yet, but it hopefully will be soon, ALK Info, it complements my book since it provides comprehensive data not included in the book. And I hope that later on you will get back to the site and browse through it, and I hope that this digital platform will help other researchers studying pre-modern Korea, East Asia, to understand social history, art history, cultural geography a bit deeper, and maybe they can also incorporate that into their teaching or their research. Now moving to the historical development of graffiti inscriptions at Kmgangsan. So rock inscriptions were commissioned primarily by so-called elite travelers, and I will be happy in the Q&A to talk more about what I mean by elite. The photograph on the left-hand side is from the early 20th century, but it provides some indication of the modes of transportation used by late Joseon period elites. And on their way to Kmgangsan, they would often travel on horseback or bureau. And as the mountain trails at Kmgangsan can be very steep and very rocky for horses, local farmers and Buddhist monks would carry the elites through the mountain in wooden litters, such as the ones you can see here. This is called kama. And so this would be the type of transportation for the elites in the mountain itself. In the early Joseon, travelers wrote autographs in ink on the walls or beams of a temple or a pavilion. So Nam Hyo-on, of which you can see an excerpt here of his travel diary, he visited Kmgangsan in 1485, and he wrote his name on the walls of Myogi-sang Am, a small hermitage located next to the Myogi-sang Buddha. And Zhong Gon-su also, I found in his diary, he also wrote that he wrote his name in ink on a boulder near Mirukte. Their ink marks have not survived. Luckily, their travel diaries have survived, but the ink marks have not. So those mentionings in their records, written records, are the only evidence we have from the early Joseon that show that people were commemorating their visit through these casual, ephemeral marks on mud walls and the flat surfaces of impressive cliffs and giant boulders. But in contrast to later informal writing practices, these travelers never had the intention to having their autograph inscriptions carved. During the 16th and early 17th century, we see a shift happening. At that point, carved autographs were still fairly uncommon, but some elite travelers began to have poetic phrases carved into the rocks of famous places. And one of these places was Mampoktong in Inner Kŭmgang, and it's a very famous phrase that many Joseon scholars know about by 16th century government official Yang Saon. He came from an exalted Yangban family, and this inscription is one of the very few inscriptions at Kmgangsan that are slogans or poems and not autographs. So Yang, he was a very famous calligrapher in his lifetime and later on, and he had made a name for himself in elite circles through his outstanding calligraphy skills, particularly the white cursive or Kwangcho or Kwangchao script. And his inscription at Hwangpakdong is just one of many where he excelled in showing his skills and having it carved. And this particularly slogan in Inner Kŭmgang became kind of a significant cultural destination for Mitchelson elites to go to and to admire. We have very few works on paper extant by Yang, which makes this rock inscription even more valuable. And it was arranged in these like 4 vertical columns of 2 characters each that can be translated as, this is Hongne Pungak's prime grotto heaven. And of course, there's a Taoist connection, which I will skip. I mean, I can come back to it later in the Q&A if you like, but just to keep with the time, I will mostly talk about the style because that's important for this discussion about eliteness. So the style, the choice of style is kind of unusual, because for a rock inscription later on, travelers typically chose regular script or heso or kaishu. Choso or taoshu was traditionally reserved for private correspondence. So Yang's decision to write his inscription in white cursive for public viewing is strikingly bold and unusual. So he must have been very confident in his calligraphy skills. Since Yang's inscription revealed typical characteristics of white cursive, such as rounded brush strokes, fluent turns and line changes, varying pressure on the brush, resulting in thinner and thicker modulations of the line. All that shows us that he was familiar with Tang and Ming Dynasty calligraphy works, such as those in the continuous cursive style of Zhang Bi and Zhu Yunming and Li Dongyang. And in the Ming Dynasty, the white cursive actually underwent a revival among the Chinese literati. And as Yang Xiaoen's case demonstrates, Joseon Dynasty scholars readily adopted the Ming fashion of elegantly expressing oneself in white cursive. And as a talented calligrapher who reached a high artistic level through such studies, Yang's choice of white cursive is an expression of high cultural status, which he displayed at Kmgangsan. And in particular, the style of Zhang Bi, the Ming scholar Zhang Bi, seems to have exerted influence on his style. Zhang's quick placement of dots and the rhythmic alternation in the size and thickness of strokes appears in a similar fashion in Yang's work. However, Yang not only copied other masters, but he also developed his own individual style, thereby manifesting his artistic prowess. His characters do not expand and shrink as much as those of Huaisu or Zhang Bi, and the overall layout of his work provides more space between characters. In fact, rather than expressing an emotional, spontaneous response, Yang's characters reveal restraint due to their uniform width and the even number of characters per column. And from the 17th century onward, we see another shift happening. Elite travelers began to write their names at Mampokdong, next to Yang Xiaoen's inscriptions and other sites nearby. And most travelers wrote their names in ink, but a few privileged travelers had their names carved. And these carved autographic inscriptions were a visual record of government officials' political power. Lee Kyung-seok, a prime minister at the time of his visit to Kmgangsan in 1651, he explains the social background of individuals who had their names carved right next to Yang Xiaoen's inscription, writing that among the people traveling to these mountains, the powerful ones copied, holding large axes and chisels, they carve into the rock, and in that way the marvelous boulders and grotesque rocks will not stay intact, which in fact they did not for long. So that was the beginning. Basically, you have the elite, the upper elite, having their names carved as a sign of their power. Here's another example from the 17th century of a powerful official and his family and friends having their names carved near Myeogi-sang. And this is Kim Il-kwi, who visited Kmgangsan in 1651 and 52. And this is an agnatic associative cluster, meaning that the cluster has names of male members of his family, but also names of associates or friends or colleagues. High-ranking officials traveling with their entourage commonly had their names carved in agnatic clusters. And in this case, it was Kim Il-kwi and his concubine's son, Kmgangsan, and others who had their names carved right at the Myogi-san Buddha. And yeah, as I said earlier, Myogi-san was just like the last waypoint that of the route that people took through Inner Kŭmgang before embarking on the latter half of the trip to the outer part of the mountain. Elite travelers generally did not carve their names themselves, but actually ordered local masons to carve the names for them. And there were several different methods to make such a carving request. Since Kim Il-kwi visited the mountains as part of his official tour as governor of Gangwon, he probably chose to submit a formal carving request. So for such a request, usually the youngest member of the group, so in this case, probably his son, Manjung, wrote the party's names on a piece of paper, and that was then handed to a local engraver monk, and it was requested that it be carved later at a specific location. And engravers would use the method of attaching paper copies onto the stone to transfer the travelers' names to the rock. And this practice was common until the early 18th century. And then from then on, around the mid 18th century onward, perhaps in an effort to better control the process, travelers more frequently wrote their names directly on the rock instead of giving the monks a piece of paper with their names. And by the 1740s and 50s, the writing and carving of autographs had become a complementary element in the elite travelers' routine. So we have not only the higher ups, the higher elites, but also the lower elites and the near elites that had their names carved. So by the mid 18th century, the high-ranking officials had basically lost their privilege to have their names carved at that point, because anyone with government connections and money could get their names carved. And an album by an anonymous painter illustrates this practice. It depicts the figures of travelers at Mampokdong at 10,000 Volts Ravine. And while some travelers sit idly or walk around the ravine with a walking stick, we have one of them engaging in the activity of writing their name. Climbing up the boulder with a dripping wet brush in his right hand, the traveler prepares to write the second character of his name, having finished the first character. So such a scene might have been a common sight at Kmgangsan in the 18th and 19th centuries. Elite travelers wrote their names themselves, but they were not the ones carving them. So the carving was done by local masons, and they were not necessarily monks. They could be just local masons attracted to this kind of business of carving travelers' names. So this still image is from the documentary video In the Land of Morning Calm, recorded by Benedictine missionary Norbert Weber in 1925, and it shows two masons carving travelers' names at Kmgangsan. It is a rare, really rare visual record showing us what it must have looked like in the late Joseon when carvers were chiseling the names of travelers into the rocks. And the names of these carvers are lost to us, but their work remains. This slide shows an associative cluster, which typically consists of a mix of elite and non-elite names, or only non-elite names. So this cluster is has the names of individuals employed at the royal court. So the eldest member of the group and the presumed leader is the eunuch Hwang Yunmyong, who was active in the late 19th century. He was the personal eunuch attendant of King Kojong and Crown Prince Ichok. And to the left of his name, you see three more names, all carved next to each other and in the same height and the same size, indicating equivalence in social rank. So Hwang obviously had a higher status because his name is larger, carved in larger characters. And this cluster visualizes the friendship of 4 royal court colleagues, basically. And without this inscription at Kmgangsan, we would most likely not know about their friendship. So the rise of associative clusters in late 18th and 19th centuries, such as the eunuch joining cluster we just looked at, signifies a paradigmatic shift in the use of Kmgangsan mountain space as heterotopic space that challenged the elite's formerly exclusive privilege of carving names. And by the 19th century, Kmgangsan had become a social battleground, so to speak, where travelers could reaffirm their social identity by establishing links with individuals of higher or equal social standing, whom the inscriber admired, but to whom he was not related. So with this context of increased spatial competition among substrata of elites and near-elites, what did the high elites do, right? They felt kind of threatened by that. And so they developed tactics to render their inscriptions more visible among the graffiti. And the actual elites began to distinguish their signatures from those of others in various ways. And one of them was the visibility of their inscriptions. So in comparison to earlier inscriptions on the 17th and 18th century, late 18th and 19th century inscriptions of high elite travelers are much larger. And an inscription at Ongyudong or Jade Stream Ravine is an example for that trend. So this one was carved in 4 rows in large characters. It's now partially become invisible because of some concrete that was slapped onto it in the late 20th century. But we can still decipher Kwancheol Governor Kim Shion and his sons Hwan-su and Cheong-su. And this phrase was written by Kim Shion, who was governor of Gangwon in 1861. And during that time, he traveled to the mountain with his 2 sons. Kim Hwan-su was only a low-ranking government official when he traveled to the mountain with his father, but later on, he had an illustrious career at the royal court as headmaster of the Royal Academy and governor of Hangwei and Chungcheong. So owing to the abundance of inscribed names, at that point when they traveled to the mountain, there was hardly any space left on the surface of any rock or any boulder, any surface where people could carve their names. So exercising his political authority, the governor carved his and his sons' names over others' inscriptions and in much larger characters. So their photographs overwrite smaller characters of previous travelers, such as this one by Chi Song-hye. He was a late 16th, early 17th century scholar. So his name was overwritten by Wan-su's Zha or Zi character. So by comparison, if you compare Chi Song-hye and Kim Shion, it's just 1/5 of the size of the governor's name. Secondly, this is another. So this just shows you how what the path looks like now today. Secondly, travelers carefully chose the placement of their inscription. So they had different options where they could carve their name: on the rock floor, or the side of a boulder, or on a peak of a cliff. And I suspect that there was a slight preference for spots at the sides of boulders and cliffs that were higher up, because the higher up, the more visible they were, even from a distance. And so the 4 inscriptions you can see here were carved at the peak of this pinnacle at Manmulcho in Outer Kŭmgang. And by the way, the lower left of this photograph shows a plaque commemorating the visits of the dear leaders Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il to Kŭmgangsan in the 1940s and 1970s. So there are contemporary North Korean inscriptions at this mountain that are also placed in high altitude to increase the visibility of these inscriptions, to showcase the contemporary North Korean government's power. So this photograph displays the top part of this pinnacle, and we have the 4 names of these hierarchical officials. The earliest one is this one, Nami-ik, who was governor of Gangwon in 1815, and then a couple of years later, we have another magistrate of Gosong. Gosong was a district nearby Kŭmgangsan, Iiksu, who had his name carved. And then we have Park Yong-soo, and lastly, we have Lee Ge-jo. And Lee Ge-jo and Park Yong-soo were actually friends and probably traveled to the mountain together. And you can see that also by a similar height and size of their calligraphy, which indicates equal social rank. So these inscriptions demonstrate that spots in high altitude were prime real estate. And the more visible a surface was to passers-by, the more valuable it was to carve one's name there. And the elegant calligraphy of government official Zhong, written in clerical seal script that you can see here on the upper left, compare this one to the inscription on the lower right by Hong Do-gun, who was actually a Jungin, so he was near elite, he was not elite, a physician working at the royal court. So Hong's inscription is small, faint, and unembellished, and in comparison, we have Zhong, who wrote in this kind of clerical script, seal script mix that was, very popular in Qing Dynasty, China, where we have calligraphers such as Yi Bing-shou, who really popularized this style. And Yi adopted this style, showing that he was able to create this impressive memory of himself by alluding to his culture capital, knowing about the latest calligraphy trends coming in from Qing China. So these two inscriptions really highlight those clear distinctions between a higher elite and a non-elite in terms of spatial visibility, connection to cultural trends in China, and also size based on the prominence and social status of the signatory. Ultimately, inscribing one's name in larger size at prominent locations, etc., became increasingly ineffective in the late 19th century because there were more and more near-elite groups adopting or copying the elite's practice. So in conclusion, to my knowledge, Kŭmgangsan has the largest collection of autographic inscriptions in East Asia and perhaps the world. Autographic inscriptions constitute spatial reference points for the construction of sociocultural memory. By reciting and composing poetry and carving their autographs, travelers followed a set of cultural conventions that identified them as literati. And through such performative activities, travelers contributed to the collective memory of a larger community of literati that transcended their own lifetimes and their immediate social milieu. And one outstanding late Joseon development in all of this is that these inscriptions were often like part of agnatic clusters. So it's the agnatic clusters are really like a big part of I don't want to say the word, but the uniqueness of late Joseon autographic graffiti, evidencing the late Joseon's elites' adoption of orthodox Confucian principles of kin relationships and connections to claim social, political, and cultural hegemony over lower elites and near elites. These male agnatic clusters, which were exclusive to central elites and individuals with government positions, point to the fact that late Joseon was a lineage society with extended elite families organized on the principle of patrilineal descent. And the growing number of carved inscriptions by various individuals from the mid-18th century onward reveals this intense social competition in late Joseon that disrupted the existing norms and customs of elite travel and shaped new modes of socio-spatial demeanor as it eroded the distinction between central elites and provincial elites, office holders and non-office holders. Transforming Kmgangsan into a heterotopic space where they left stable marks for future travelers to admire, these lower elites and near elites, such as the inscription by the physician that we just looked at, challenged the cultural hegemony over the mountains established earlier by the central elites and the high officials. This research of autographic inscriptions has taught me that the exploration of underappreciated details can lead to substantial insights into the culture of a society. It is therefore my hope that my Carving Status book will inspire broader interdisciplinary methodologies and frameworks to understand East Asian visual, material, and performative culture, as well as literature and social history. And these autographic inscriptions, set in the beauty of Kmgangsan, are a great privilege to have as a resource because they allow us to detect biases in our own interpretation of elite-generated source material, which is often the only material that remains for recognizing and examining a distinctive culture. Thank you so much for listening, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A.
Okay, thank you very much, Maya. You can stop sharing the screen. If any of you have questions, you can use the Q&A or chat or raise your hand. We can also allow you to use your microphone to ask the questions. Let me begin with a kind of a straightforward background question, because I noticed there are a lot of students attending your lecture. You're very popular. First of all, explain to us why the Diamond Mountains, or Kŭmgangsan, was so important to the Koreans. You have mentioned, for example, there were Buddhist images and perhaps inscriptions, probably belonging to an earlier period by the late Joseon. Of course, the Confucian influence affects the cultural practice. And one cursive script, you also mentioned Taoist elements. And then at some point, the Diamond Mountains also became a kind of a national symbol, the same way Mount Fuji became a national symbol for Japan. So just explain to us, mostly to the students, why the Diamond Mountains were so important in Korea. Do you find any comparable site where people would carve the names or leave the generations of names on the rock face?
Sure. Let me share my because I have a slide about that with a map that I made when I was still a grad student. So it's not perfect. It's like a couple of years old, but yeah, sure. So Kŭmgangsan, and that's actually a part of my UCLA dissertation. The dissertation was a lot about the multi-religious elements in the Kŭmgangsan landscape, and in my dissertation I primarily focused on the Buddhist aspects of pilgrimages to Kŭmgangsan. And the book that just came out, basically the research for this book came after my dissertation. So this book is really the product of basically my Harvard years, like the years I spent at Harvard and later on, where I wrote this book. So it is only tangentially related to my dissertation, actually. And I hope, I mean, I published quite a few articles from, chapters from my dissertation as journal articles. But as you can see here on the lower left, you see, I mean, on the left side, you see Myogi-sang Buddha on the upper left, and then the Samburam, the three Buddhas on the left or lower left. This is from the late Goryeo, and shows us that at that point in time, the 14th century, we have pilgrimages to the mountain for the worship of Buddhist divinities that were associated with Kmgangsan. And there was one particular deity, Dharmakata Bodhisattva, that was associated with, he was believed to reside at the mountain. And this is something that commonly is considered to be coming out of Shilla, but I believe it's more a late Goryeo development, because we don't really see Kmgangsan being mentioned as a Buddhist pilgrimage site prior to the late Goryeo. And then when you look at the top part here of the slide, there is a relic container, and then there are these like smaller sculptures about which I published a separate article on sculpture burials at Kmgangsan. So these sculptures that you see on the upper right of, this is like an Amitabha triad which has Kshiti Kharaba or Tijang Bosal as one of his attendants. This is a particular feature of late Goryeo, early Joseon Amitabha triads. This shows us a separate element of Buddhist pilgrimages of Kmgangsan, moving to like the early Joseon. So when Pure Land practice became really prevalent, and these sculptures were buried in the mountain and adjacent to peaks that were associated with Dharmakata Bodhisattva. And I believe, at least that's what I say in that article, that those sculpture burials of Amitabha triads were an offering to Dharmakata, to the mountain itself. And of course, they were buried on peaks that are also associated with, being close to, like, the peaks were considered to have the highest spiritual powers, and looking at like shamanic practices, for instance. So, and then near Kŭmgangsan, near at Samir Lake, we also have the burial of wood, scented wood, as to worship Maitreya. So we have a number of different Buddhist beliefs, be it Maitreya, Amitabha, three Buddhas. We don't really know exactly in what kind of ritual context the three Buddha rock was carved. It might come out of imperial support. We know that in the late Goryeo, when Goryeo was under a Mongol rule, that there was imperial support by Empress Ji or Empress Gi, who was of Korean descent, who supported Chang'ansa and Gyeonsa at the mountain. So it may come out of this kind of context of imperial and royal support for Kŭmgangsan monasteries that we see the carving of these kinds of mayabul, but the exact ritual context is kind of unclear. It may have something to do with repentance rituals to the three Buddhas, but it's not entirely clear. And then Taoism, yes, that opens up an entirely different subject again, and it's because of this diversity of different themes. You know, we got Amitabha worship, Maitreya worship, we got Taoist ideas, shamanic ideas that come in together at Kmgangsan, and I eventually decided to put all these different aspects of Kmgangsan's religious traditions into separate journal articles rather than writing one book about them. And it just so happened that the graffiti project turned out to be a better project for a book project, because I was able to, really have like a red thread through like a couple of chapters that was kind of focused on the graffiti. And with the various Buddhist elements and Taoist elements, or shamanic elements, it would have been like too diverse to put it all into like one book manuscript. Yeah, if we look at Yang Saon's inscription, and let me see if I can find that real quick, we have in the early Joseon, we have this kind of tendency also in the literature of Taoist illusions, this idea of being a Confucian scholar, and he was very active as a government official. He was commended by the locals for his excellent leadership. And so people like Yang Saon, who had been government officials for many, many years, were just longing for the life of like a Taoist immortal in the mountains, and just doing readings and so on and so forth. And so it's this kind of Taoist illusion that we can see here in this slogan. I personally, in my book, I argue that it's more a cultural trope. He was responding to certain like cultural conventions or expectations during his time. I would not consider this as an expression of Taoist practices or anything. So I would rather say that it was, part of his like culture capital that he was making these Taoist illusions, rather than a reference to actual a Taoist practice at Kmgangsan. But there is evidence that there were so-called elite government officials in the late Joseon traveling to Kmgangsan. conducting rituals at waterfalls and at the ponds, like Guryeongyeon, like the Nine Dragon ponds or pools, where due to inclement weather, some officials were unable to travel far, and so they held rituals to the dragons to trying to control the weather. And so we have some evidence because those literati left records of those prayers to the local dragon deities. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, great. We have one question from the audience. How many years have you committed to this study on Kŭmgangsan?
Oh, that's a great question. I would say, including everything like the religious aspects and the more cultural, social aspects, I would say since 2008, which is when I began my graduate studies at UCLA, and I was trained in Buddhist studies, so I really focused on the Buddhist aspects of Kmgangsan for my dissertation. But then from that, I expanded further and studied secular travel in the late Joseon, because I was interested in learning more about pilgrimage in the late Joseon, particular Buddhist pilgrimages, but there wasn't that much evidence for that in the literature. They were all talking about more like secular habits, painting and composing poetry and carving their names. And so my book project was basically driven by the material that I found, right? And the material I found was not what I had hoped to find, but it was the rock inscriptions and the travel diaries that led me to a different direction. And I'm grateful for having had the opportunity to study those inscriptions for so long. But I'm also happy to move on to my next chapter of moving on to Joseon history, the Joseon history of Buddhist monasteries and how they're connected to like fundraising tactics and economic strategies for survival. And that's like my current project. So Kmgangsan will probably follow me for the rest of my life because people will ask me about it, and I will be happy to talk about it. And there is a lot of economic data about Buddhist monasteries that I haven't had time to discuss in my book, but that I hope to use for my current book project on temple monastic economy, like land ownership of the temples, for example. These are records that were recorded in the early 20th century, but I think that they also include repair and construction records from the late Joseon. Basically, that's what the Japanese could get hold of in the monastic archives. And unfortunately, all the Buddhist monasteries at Kmgangsan were destroyed during the Korean War. And so luckily, we have those archival records that were published during the colonial period, and my current research draws heavily on those records.
Okay, so I want to see if Joseph has any question before we go to another question. For those typing in questions, please don't be anonymous. Provide your name, okay?
I was actually going to welcome more of my own students that are in the audience, the virtual audience, to type their questions. Students currently enrolled in my Korean Civilization in 1900 class. While we wait for them to brainstorm and perhaps pose a few, just really quick, I was curious more if you could very quickly just talk about what you mean by near elites, like who exactly is included in this group. Are these members of what Kim Won called secondary status groups, like Jungin middle people, the Seoul, the illegitimate sons of Yangban, like who exactly is included in this group?
Yes, exactly. So the near elites are more or less the Jungin, but I don't use the term Jungin that much because we have as Kim Won says, secondary status groups. that's basically another term that is used in the literature, I guess. So with near elite, I'm referring to Zhong, I'm referring to concubine sons, all those. I also refer to, they don't appear as much as in the book as I would like, but we have like local like village leaders that have, you know, they are like, they had like hereditary administrative positions in the late Joseon that I would also call near elite because they were somewhat literate. Yeah, and then we have all these different layers of elites, right? We got those higher elites living in the capital, and then the Confucian scholars, particularly in the Gyeongsang, now Gyeongsang, Yeongnam region, that were founding all these Confucian schools, et cetera, et cetera. So, and then in the late Joseon, as you well know, we have a number of merchant families who, you know, with money were able to buy themselves government titles and pretend that they're elite, although they never made it into the real elite because the real elite knew where they were coming from. And so we have a lot of like flexibility towards the end of the Joseon with, you know, the social status.
Okay, Maya, we have two questions. The first one is, does contemporary North Korean government put active efforts in preserving and studying the inscriptions? And then the next question from Jade Gregor, which part of Kŭmgangsan was your favorite to visit and photograph? And then there's another one coming in. Were there female elites traveling to Kŭmgangsan?
Yes, these are all great questions.
Yes.
Thank you so much, everyone, for great questions. Yes, so what the contemporary North Korean government does, they, I noticed that some of the inscriptions they had tried to erase them. And I think it's because some of the inscriptions were actually carved by the Japanese during the colonial period, because during the colonial period, Kmgangsan became the mass tourist site that it never was during the Joseon, you know, where we have like, up until the late 1910s, we have only a couple hundred people traveling to Kmgangsan, but then with the establishment of roads and railroads to Kmgangsan, the numbers surge up to 30,000 travelers a year. And so we have many people traveling to Kmgangsan in the 1930s and 40s. And I believe many, I photographed some Japanese people's names, but many of these names have been made illegible by the North Korean government due to their attitude towards the Japanese, of course. Some of the inscriptions were highlighted in red, as is traditionally done. And I believe that some of those may be traces from earlier times, but I believe that some of them are also ones that were highlighted by the North Koreans. I would have to go back and look in my notes which ones they highlighted. I would say that right now they're not putting an extra effort into preserving any inscriptions because the North Koreans are not aware of the value of these inscriptions, not yet. And I mean, even in South Korea, there are thousands of rock inscriptions in South Korea, particularly near Buddhist monasteries at sacred mountains in South Korea, and nobody has ever written about them because they were considered just, you know, like writings they're not valuable enough to be considered for any serious scholarship. So I think my book, if the North Koreans ever see my book, they may realize what treasure they have and will be more careful about not putting more concrete on the paths. But there were some North Korean graffiti that had been carved over the Joseon ones. So we have these kind of different layers of pre-modern and modern inscriptions. And which part of Kmgangsan was my favorite? I would say, as I identify myself primarily as a Buddhist art historian, I would say that the ones where I saw the Maebul were probably the most impressive for me, like the Samburam, the Three Buddha Rock. Actually, if you go around the Three Buddha Rock, there are 60 more little Buddhas on the back. And then there was, I think it was a Kwanum, so Avalokiteshvara on the side. So just seeing the context was, the spatial context was super interesting for me. And then also seeing some of the sculptures inside of Pyohunsa. So Pyohunsa itself had been destroyed, but some of the sculptures are still extant, and these are like mid-17th century sculptures, and I was super excited to see those. Nobody's ever published anything about them. I hope to publish something about these sculptures at some point. So that was really a highlight for me. And yes, there are female elites traveling to Kŭmgangsan, so we have some evidence for inscriptions even, but they date from the early 20th century. And I would say they're not necessarily elite. So I have the inscription of Che Songseldang. She was the nanny of the last prince of Joseon, and she was a Buddhist. She identified as a Buddhist, and she traveled to Kŭmgangsan on her 60th birthday and had her name carved at Mampokdong. And of course, there's literature about like 18th century Giseng who traveled to Kŭmgangsan either on their own or together with their lovers. So we have some evidence for that. Oh, I found one inscription by a Giseng actually. It's gonna be on my website. I added it to my website. I also mentioned it in my book briefly. An 18th century Giseng who wrote her name, and then she added that she was a government Giseng. So she probably traveled with maybe a governor, was part of the entourage of a governor who traveled to Kŭmgangsan. But that was 1 out of 4,500, very rare.
Joseph, do you have any more questions?
That was something I'm glad Asuka is one of my students. I'm glad she raised that question because that's something I was wondering about as well. Because your presentation makes it seem like this is a very male space. And certainly what we know about elite Korean practices, that would make sense, right? And as I explained to my students, as you all know, in the recording of Korean genealogies, men were recorded by name, women were just recorded by surname or as wife of so-and-so. But I'm glad you answered that question because I suspected there might be exceptions. And it seems like there's at least one exception.
Well, one thing, before you ask your next question, Joseph, one thing I noticed while I was doing post-work graphical analysis of the inscriptions is that, in a jokbo, you only have agnatic male relationships. So it's patrilineal, right? But with the jokbo, with the clusters at Kmgangsan, we actually see sometimes that someone who was not directly related to an ancestor added their name, so they kind of squeezed themselves in. This is what I refer to as kind of social engineering, becoming part of this larger lineage by adding their name next to the cluster. And I found some clusters with where they were not related through the male agnatic line, but they like a descendant wrote their name next to their maternal grand uncle or something. So you have a relationship that is maternal rather than paternal. Mm. And we see this, we can see this at Kmgangsan. We don't see this in jokbo because jokbo is male centered. I mean, like paternal centered.
I guess I wanted to just hear a little bit more because I teach pre-modern and modern Korean history, but my training is ultimately modern Korea and have a special focus on the colonial period. And so I wanted to hear, and in my office at UVA, I have postcards from the colonial period of Mount Kongo or Mount Kŭmgangsan.
Ah, nice.
And so I wanted to hear more. I know during the colonial period, it was, promoted by the Japanese government as a tourist site. And you mentioned inscriptions and inscription practices by Japanese and Koreans during that period. So I wanted you to talk a little bit more about that period and inscription practices in that period. I know it's a little out the purview of the lecture, but if you could humor me a bit, does inscription practices, you saw some photograph and film stills, are they more or less very similar to what they were in the late Chosun in the colonial period, or are there new technologies or in particular inscription practices put in place? Does the Japanese government try to control or restrict it to any extent? You just speak on that a little bit. I'd really appreciate it.
Yeah, my study kind of ends with 1910, but I looked at inscriptions. I logged them because some of them were dated, and they were dated Taisho something. So we know that they are from the early 20th century. What's his name? He teaches at University of Texas in Austin. Oh, what's his name? He published an article about inscriptions in Gyeongju, right? At Sokuram, I think, where we have groups of people writing their name in ink, I believe, next to the
Robert Oppenheim.
Robert Oppenheim, exactly, yeah. And so he ties this to like imperial narratives and self-identity and all that. But yeah, the colonial history of inscriptions is something I would probably have to look into. Like, I have the data, but I haven't had time to look into it more deeply. I know from the data that I have that the practice of inscribing continued, but I'm not sure if any data exists as to how common it was to do that at Kmgangsan. Because if we look at 19th century inscriptions, they are, generally speaking, way larger than any earlier inscriptions, because people just, they had to overwrite, they had to go over other inscriptions to make themselves visible. And so I think by the early 20th century, there was basically no space to write. It was all covered. And all we can see today is the carved ones. I believe throughout time, there were also people who just wrote their names in ink. And those are the ones that have not survived. There's actually one spot at Kmgangsan where there is a little bit of an ink inscription that I think is from the Joseon. But other than that, we have no ink jottings that survive. But I think the ink part was part of the tradition as well. So I'm focusing on the carving part, but we got ink writings, we got carved writings. What I know from the colonial period that continued up until the colonial period are writings on the beams of pavilions. So we see this at Kmgangsan, we see this throughout Korea up until the colonial period, that people who visited pavilions would write their names in ink or have them carved at pavilion beams. And some of those actually have the names of male officials and then giseng names. So it was the entire party, male and female attendants, that would have their names jotted down to commemorate the event. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, no, great. It's all very interesting and new to me, so thank you.
Yeah, Maya, that is very interesting to me because I'm thinking of the national parks in the US. The founding of national parks is to preserve nature as it is without markings of human activities. So the Diamond Mountains has been preserved as a national park, then we would not have any of these inscriptions.
Right. That's true.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's currently marketed in North Korea as, it is actually a national park in North Korea. North Korea, as you know, really suffers from deforestation. So whenever you go to North Korea, all you see is just barren land. But when you approach sacred mountains like Kŭmgangsan or Kmgangsan, and suddenly you have this lush vegetation, and that's because they punish really severely those who try to steal wood from that area. Yeah.
Well, without further questions, let's officially finish today's lecture. And of course, we'll stay on to chat a little bit. And thank you all for coming. And I hope you will come back next semester and join us for another series of East Asia Center lectures. Thank you, everyone.